G'day, I'm Rowan Mackey and welcome to Individuate, the podcast where we use the vehicle of starting our own podcast to try and get the best out of ourselves in the service of others. Today, we've got a bit of a follow-up to last week's episode. I want to get into this idea of teacher versus preacher a bit more, but I also want to introduce the work of another one of my favourite authors. I feel like I'm saying that a lot at the moment, but I suppose they would have been my favourite authors if they weren't coming up on the podcast like this. Today will probably be the last episode we have on the creativity and learning side of things for a little while. It's definitely something that's likely to come up again, but I'm keen to move on after we've explored this a fair bit lately. Before we do though, I want to tell you about someone who learnt how to learn and transcend his education, and it helped him to become one of the best martial artists of all time. Bruce Lee was born the youngest of 4 children in San Francisco in 1940. He was the son of an opera singer, and his father had brought his family to America for a music tour just before Bruce was born. Known as Junfan Lee to his family, he was given the name Bruce by a nurse at the hospital and did not go by that name until he'd passed preschool. Lee appeared in his first film at the age of 3 months, when he was a stand-in for an American baby in the film Golden Gate Girl in 1941. Although he was born in America, Lee's family returned to Hong Kong when he was only a young boy in the early 1940s, and life changed greatly for the young Lee. Hong Kong was then occupied by Japan in the midst of World War II, and although he was able to study and practice dance throughout his childhood, even winning the Cha-Cha competition of Hong Kong, as well as being known for his poetry, he experienced regular violence throughout his upbringing. In Hong Kong, Lee faced the difficulty of being an outsider. He was not purely Chinese, so the other students made fun of him. He also wasn't British like the other kids in his private school, so he was frequently taunted for his racial background. With tension ever present throughout his schooling years, Lee turned to fighting to get himself through. So much so that fighting began to define him. He wasn't doing well academically, and he was fighting so frequently at a young age that he was transferred to a different primary school. At the age of 13, Lee met his teacher, Master Yip Man, who accepted young Lee into his famous school of Wing Chun, a style of the martial art Kung Fu. Continuing the pattern from the rest of his education experience, Lee was taunted at the school. His racial background led the other students to lambast him, feeling that he wasn't enough like them to be allowed to learn the sacred technique. Lee constantly had to prove himself and his abilities to his peers, and this led to Lee finding himself in more and more conflict situations. After one particularly eventful fight, a high-ranking police officer had approached Lee's parents and told them that he was going to arrest their boy, as the night before Lee had beaten up the officer's son. Lee's father quickly arranged for him to return to America, where Lee was still a citizen, and so he left Hong Kong with $100 to his name. Arriving in America with nothing, Lee picked up work where he could. He worked in hospitality, washing dishes and running food. He also picked up work teaching dance, and eventually, martial arts. Lee wasn't just a proficient exponent of Wing Chun within himself, he was prepared to teach other people. We'll come back to this a little later in today's podcast, so take note of this, because I think it's an important step in Lee's development. In Lee's martial arts school, he developed a reputation for allowing everyone to come and learn his techniques. Regardless of racial background, Lee opened himself to anyone who wanted to be taught by him. This drew the ire of the Chinese community in Oakland, who felt that the techniques Lee was teaching people should not be open to those outside the Chinese community. Eventually, he was forced to physically defend his right to teach. Lee was challenged to a fight by the Chinese traditionalists, who presented him with an ultimatum. If Lee won the fight, he could keep his school and continue to teach his students of a diverse background. If he lost, however, he would be forced to close his school and stop teaching people who didn't have a pure enough Chinese background. Although he had been taught from the school of Wing Chun, Lee's fighting style was unique. Due to his experience dancing, he'd adapted elements of his style that were unlike any other proponent of Kung Fu or indeed Wing Chun. Where most fighters had a stagnant stance, Lee moved around, incorporating elements of rhythm and movement into his fighting positions, which other fighters did not have. Because of this, Lee's ability to adapt to his opponent's movement was vastly superior. It's interesting to note Lee's experience with dance and how he references it with his most famous quote, often abbreviated with a much shorter 3-word version. Lee's most famous phrase came from a longer quote in which he said, "Be formless and shapeless like water. Now, put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. Put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. Put water into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now, water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend." Knowing that Lee's background in dance allowed him to create more dynamic fighting positions compared to his more stagnant opponents, I can't help feel that without his experience dancing, Lee wouldn't have been able to create such dynamic movement, or indeed have such an emphasis on movement in the first place. Lee recognised the advantage that this gave him, and so he'd included other adaptations into his style too. It was as if he'd used Wing Chun as a starting point, and integrated elements from other practices such as boxing, fencing, and dancing. This fight with Lee and the traditionalists was a major turning point in the history of martial arts. It was the traditionalist, orthodox way of thinking against the new, and Lee had it all on the line. He did not have a steady source of income outside of his martial arts school, and his wife was 8 months pregnant when the fight took place. After 3 minutes, the fight ended. Lee had managed to subdue his opponent after 3 long minutes. The minutes were not long for Lee, however, whose opponent seemed to read the writing on the wall from pretty early on, and according to Lee's wife, Linda, spent the entirety of the 3 minutes running around the room away from Lee, who was finally able to catch up with him and perform a takedown, winning the fight. After the fight was finished, although he'd won, Linda found Lee with his head in his hands. Lee told her that his training didn't prepare him for this type of battle. As she describes it, this was the beginning of the development of Lee's own style of martial arts. He had codified the need to make adaptations to his Wing Chun, and this realization was the beginning of a revolution in the world of martial arts. After making this realization, Lee became even less rigid with the application of his style. He openly took influences from other martial arts outside of Kung Fu and Wing Chun and created his own style, which was based on a broader philosophy of martial arts, not just from one single school. Lee later said in an interview, "I don't believe in styles anymore. I don't believe there's such a thing as the Chinese way of fighting or the Japanese way of fighting. When people come to me, they're not coming to me to learn to defend themselves. They want to learn to express themselves through movement, anger, or determination." For Lee, it wasn't about conflict. It was about self-expression. Lee believed that the individual was more important than any system or style. He recognised that it was about finding the best system for the individual, not just the best system or the best school in black and white terms. Bruce Lee is remembered today as a film star, a philosopher, and one of the most accomplished martial artists in history, a true revolutionary of the sport. He did this because of everything that we've been speaking about over the past few episodes. Think of how much purposeful practice he would have had throughout his childhood and adolescence. He was fighting people, so he would have been incentivized to be present while he was practicing. If he didn't learn to self-correct, he'd end up getting slogged in the mouth. Even with his dancing, he was a cha-cha champion, so he clearly had ability, but he was also able to contextualize the importance of dancing, something not many other boys his age may have been able to do. But he recognized the value in being purposeful in his dance practice, even if it was just to help his fighting abilities. Lee also had a teacher, Yip Man, who was himself the product of many great teachers in the school of Wing Chun before him. But Lee recognized that if he was going to be the best that he could be, he needed to transcend the education of his teacher and develop his own style that was unique to him, a style that incorporated other elements of his experience outside of the rigidity of Wing Chun. As we said before, his unique movement was influenced by his experience outside of martial arts. Yet his famous 1-inch punch technique is something that's much more traditional and would have been developed in a traditional manner, with hours of purposeful practice and self-correction, initially guided by his teachers. So it's clear that Lee was able to engage in multiple forms of learning, both from his teacher and by himself. So that's what we're going to get into today. How did Bruce Lee integrate multiple influences to form his unique style of martial arts? And how was he able to transcend his education so much that he literally chased another student of Wing Chun around the room for 3 minutes before dismantling him easily? In order to do that today, we're continuing to look at the work of Sean D'Souza, but also Jim Kwik. Jim is a world expert in memory improvement, brain optimization, and accelerated learning, so his work fits in well with what we're talking about today. But before we get to Jim, let's get back to a little bit of what we spoke about last week. One of the themes to come out of last week's podcast was from Sean D'Souza, and it was the need to find a teacher instead of a preacher. As Sean says, a preacher will simply give you information, and it's incumbent upon the students to take in that information and integrate it with their existing knowledge sufficiently. The preacher may think particular students are smart or gifted, and others are inherently flawed and unable to retain information or perform skills in the same way. The teacher, on the other hand, recognizes that we're each different, and we each need to have information tailored to us in a way that we'll actually be able to learn. The teacher recognizes that it's not their role to spew out information and have students soak it in. They instead need to transfer skills and outcomes to those under their tutelage, regardless of their individual characteristics. As educational theorist Thomas Carruthers once said, "A teacher is one who makes themselves progressively unnecessary." In order to do that, they have to be able to teach the student in a way that's progressively expanding their knowledge, rather than just exposing them to information and moving on if they don't get it. I want to get into this a little bit more today in terms of what this process looks like, because I think it's essential to learning to teach ourselves. It's also interesting to note that both Sean D'Souza and Jim Kwik have picked up on the fact that so much of our education system in the West is based around what we learn, rather than how we learn. We have access to a wide variety of subjects, yet the main mechanism we have for learning is rote memory. At school, most of the tests are based on how much information we can remember, and there's less focus on full comprehension of what's being memorized or attention paid to its broader context. For example, I remember learning the periodic table in school. Now these days, I couldn't tell you much about the periodic table beyond the really basic elements, but I still remember having to do the test on the periodic table, and we had to recite the first however many elements. My dad taught me this little trick to remember them all. It goes, H-Elabeba Kanofni, Namgal Sipsglark, Askativkramen, Fekani Cousin Gajas. During the test, I'd write out the little mnemonic and just had to remember where to separate the letters. Needless to say, I did pretty well on the test, but I'm not sure how much it enhanced my understanding of the elements of the periodic table themselves. Now, to properly talk about the process of deconstruction, we're going to have to get into some brain science, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so you have to forgive my simplified explanation. But there's a basic understanding that I think helps us to know. As I'm sure you know, the brain has two parts, the left brain and the right brain. The left brain is the methodical, analytical side of your brain. It requires systems, steps, processes, and logic. The right brain, however, is the more creative and abstract side of your brain, and doesn't require such orderly thinking. Part of the role of the right brain is to recognize patterns. What's interesting about this is that these two parts of the brain work independently. This means that you can begin to recognize patterns without being able to logically articulate what they are. It's interesting that this is backed up by the work of Jean Piaget, famous for his work around child development. Piaget observed that children could participate in games and observe the rules of the game before they were able to articulate the rules of the game. As part of his observations around children in the concrete operational stage, he noted, "Their rules of thinking seem very basic by adult standards and usually operate unconsciously. For example, a bunch of young children could all play basketball and observe the rules relatively well. But if we were to ask any of those children exactly what all of those rules were, they were unlikely to be able to list them all. So these two sides of the brain can operate independently from each other. The right brain doesn't require the left brain to consciously narrate and analyze everything that it's doing. That can come later. What the right brain, the creative brain, is doing is recognizing and eliminating errors based on recognizing patterns. The kids didn't need to be able to logically process what all of the rules of the basketball game were, because the right half of the brain had recognized the pattern that exists within the game of basketball. They'd seen the ball go out a couple of times and knew the ball went to the other team. They'd seen others bouncing the ball and knew they had to do that too. They knew that everyone else was trying to get the ball in the hoop, but it was only later, when they grew a bit older, that information was fed back into the left brain, and they were able to make logical sense of the game that they'd been participating in. I'm going to put a video on the podcast page for today, which you can access at individuate.com.au, which illustrates the process of how this works. The video is from a 1963 experiment done by the BBC, in which a sheep farmer is able to correctly identify 3 sheep from another flock that had been added to his own. The sheep look absolutely identical to the untrained eye, but the sheep farmer is able to correctly identify the sheep that weren't his own, and could even recognise and identify each individual sheep from some distance away. When prompted to explain what he was looking for by the reporter, the farmer wasn't able to articulate exactly what he was identifying. So what is it? Different colours? Different eyes? Different horns? Asked the reporter. Slightly, I suppose. It's a job to tell you the details of it. I just know they're different sheep. You asked me to look for strange sheep, and that's what I found. It's really worth checking out the video because it was quite incredible to see. So go to individuate.com.au to access the episode page for today. But what it highlights to me is that the farmer had developed his pattern recognition with sheep to such a degree that he could recognise individual sheep. A lifetime of working with many different sheep had taught him how to recognise the minute differences in each one, even though his logical brain, the left brain, wasn't able to articulate exactly what system he was implementing. He could still perform the skill based on his ability to recognise patterns. And we can do that too. We can perform a skill without having the logical steps or process in place, as long as we've recognised a pattern that we can perform within the confines of. This, as Sean D'Souza says, is part of the role of the teacher. Instead of having a preacher just give us swathes of information that isn't broken up into tiny increments, the teacher will help give us many examples, both good examples and bad examples, to help us develop an ability to recognise a pattern. If we can have a teacher who's there to actually assist us with the transferal of information, and they can help us correct our mistakes, then we are getting good examples to see what's correct. We're getting bad examples to see what's incorrect. And we're having the teacher consolidate the logical side of learning by articulating why each mistake is wrong. If we go back to Sean's 3 boxes that we spoke about last week, with box 1 being all the tasks we're hopeless at, box 2 being all the tasks we're learning at but we're still making mistakes, and box 3 is all the tasks that we're mentally automatic at. Well, we can go from box 1 to box 3 without spending as much time in box 2 if we can leverage this ability for pattern recognition. We don't necessarily require a comprehensive logical process to perform a task sufficiently. So, part of the role of the teacher is to provide good examples and bad examples for the student to begin to recognise patterns. It's interesting to remember back now and recognise this process in action. I remember at times you'd be doing something at school, whether it be problems in maths class or exercises related to English comprehension. One of the teachers would look at one of the mistakes that you'd made and they'd say, "Now, what's incorrect about this example?" And without being prompted any further, the pattern recognition side of my brain kicked in and I was able to recognise and correct my own mistake. I forgot to carry the 4. Or, it doesn't look right, I've spelled that word wrong. On closer inspection, the mistake that I'd made myself didn't look quite right and I was able to identify the issue within my own work. So the teacher in that situation was getting me to reassess the example with the pattern recognition part of my brain. In seeing there was a problem, I could correct my own work, even though I was the one who made the mistake in the first place. I think this example also gives us a clue into another role of the teacher. When the teacher asked me, what was wrong with a particular example, they weren't just helping my pattern recognition. I could then articulate what was wrong with a particular example. They were teaching me to not only recognize the mistake, but logically process why it was a mistake. They wanted to ensure the left and right side of my brain was working towards a solution. So, the role of the teacher isn't just providing good examples and bad examples to help create pattern recognition. It's also about helping the transferal of information across to the logical side of the brain. As we spoke about last week, one of the techniques that the teacher employs to do this is through deconstruction into tiny incremental steps so that the student can follow along and learn how to correctly apply each one. If you remember back to the way that you were taught maths at school, it's likely it would have been in this incremental format. First, we learn about numbers, and then addition and subtraction, then the times tables, then division. Eventually, we move on to things like algebra and calculus and trigonometry. But we can't engage in those fields of study without having first incrementally built up our knowledge to be able to grasp and apply each mathematical concept as we go through. We need to gain the prerequisite understanding to tackle something like trigonometry or algebra. This process of deconstruction involves breaking something up into tiny little sub-skills and organising a system of practice based around applying increased knowledge incrementally. One example of how this plays out in a practical sense is I remember back to school and I only really had one teacher who had a system for communicating with his students whether or not we understood something. I remember back in the day, my Latin teacher, Mr. Andrews, would have a traffic light system in class for whether we understood something. Green light meant we understood clearly and could move forward. Yellow light meant we kind of got it, but it would be helpful to spend a bit more time on it. And the red light meant we didn't get it and needed more time. Other teachers would ask whether or not you understood something, or whether something made sense, but none of them had a way of communicating this systematically. It's a tough thing as a teenager to put your hand up in front of the whole class of your peers and say that you don't understand something when it's implied that they all do. So now that I think back, this was a brilliant system to ensure that everyone had the opportunity to say they didn't understand without as much judgment. But also thinking back to it, part of what this did was to ensure that everyone was okay to move on to the next incremental step. Mr. Andrews would have been a preacher, not a teacher, if he'd moved on before all the students had understood a particular step, and this was his way of communicating with us whether or not we were ready to move on. So, another role of the teacher is to break things down into tiny increments so that each of the students can follow along and is able to apply each element of a skill correctly. The teacher needs to help the student deconstruct each element of the skill so they can articulate and process exactly why each element is important. This is how a teacher can work with a student to leverage both sides of their brain. They can help them perform a skill through pattern recognition and differentiating between the good examples and the bad examples. And then they help them to deconstruct exactly what the different elements of that skill are, to the point where they can self-correct and identify logically exactly what parts of the pattern are incorrect and why. Now, let's get back to a little bit of brain science as to why this all works. As the teacher helps the student to create patterns or logical processes, the student's brain cells are firing in a particular way. After about 90 minutes or so, these brain cells create a bridge between each other, or what's called a synapse. It takes roughly 90 minutes to build a new synapse. When the bridge is first built, it's quite flimsy. We've only just learnt the task and it's still novel, so we haven't really strengthened the synapse yet. As we continue to perform the task, our brain cells or neurons keep firing and you create a coating around the synapse to strengthen it. This coating is called myelin. As the myelin coats our neurons, they get stronger and stronger. If we continue to fire our neurons in this way for about 4 weeks, that synapse is strengthened to become a neuron as part of a neural network. The links between all of the brain cells have been strengthened so much that information can travel along them much quicker. Although our synapse started as something similar to a rickety rope bridge, as we performed the task more and more, we added extra support. Then, eventually, we concreted the bridge and gave it extra lanes. When we first had the bridge, it was all rickety, like a swinging rope bridge over a chasmic gorge. We could only walk slowly over the bridge, taking tiny step after tiny step, clutching each side of the bridge for dear life. But then, the bridge became sturdy, and we could walk and then run along the bridge without fear of falling off the edge. And eventually, it was concreted with big massive lanes, and so we could drive over the bridge. This is similar to the way in which we learn a new skill. We start with a slow, weakly connected synapse, but as we continue to perform the task and become more proficient, the connection between our brain cells can support the transferal of information at a much faster rate. Then, when something finally becomes automatic, it's as if there's no barriers to the flow of information within our brain at all. We can call upon that connection and execute a skill with fluency, and it's as if it's automatic. So what does this mean for the teacher? Well, firstly, I think it's important to recognise the way in which this process happens. We have to devise a system that slowly builds up a student's ability so that we can mirror the process in their brain. Plus, we have to ensure that a student stays with something long enough to continue, long enough to create a neural network. It's not enough to expect that they can pick up something once and they'll immediately be able to perform it to that ability again and again. The other thing is that Sean D'Souza points out when we're talking about the role of the teacher is that they need to deliver the student to a place of being able to teach the skill to someone else. If the student can tell someone else what they learnt in the sequence they learnt it and what the importance or context of that sequence was, then we can be sure that they have integrated that information proficiently. That is to say, that if they can perform the task well and understand the logical processes well enough to properly deconstruct it and break it down into tiny increments for someone else, without just completely copying the teacher, then it's likely that their own neural network has developed. So that's part of the role of the teacher, to provide enough quality examples to help the student recognise a pattern, then deconstruct or break up a skill into tiny increments so that they can follow along with each particular element. And finally, we have to deliver them to a place of being able to teach someone else. Without this, we haven't really taught someone. They haven't really developed a skill unless this is the case. I think there's also an important element to all this that wasn't highlighted as much by Sean D'Souza. Sean is the first person I've heard to use teacher versus preacher in the context that we've been using it. And with his background delivering courses and mentoring entrepreneurs, it makes sense that he's had a bit more of a focus on the teaching side of things. But for reasons that I'll explain shortly, I want to introduce something else into the equation. It comes from the work of Jim Kwik, who I mentioned at the start of the podcast. Despite being an international expert in this stuff, Kwik also suffered from an acquired brain injury as a child and had learning difficulties associated with this. Essentially, Kwik taught himself how to transcend those difficulties and basically reverse engineered intelligence. I'll put up some of his links at individuate.com.au because I can't recommend his stuff enough. But the reason that I say all this is that Kwik's focus would have been on the student side of learning. We've covered off what it means to be a good teacher, but Kwik gives us an insight into what makes a great student. In his book Limitless, Kwik lays out his system for fast learning. He calls it the FASTER method. F stands for forget. A stands for act. S for state. T is teach. E is enter. And R, review. Forget relates to forgetting our preconceived notions. We have to recognise that we're a beginner in something and be open to a new way of doing things. We also have to forget anything else that we're doing at the time to be able to concentrate properly on the new task. And finally, we need to forget any limiting beliefs that we have that are standing in the way of us achieving something. Act relates to the idea that the human brain learns from creation, not consumption. Like the idea of starting a podcast to explore the themes of individuation, we don't simply learn by passively consuming information. We need our examples. We need to practice in tiny increments, and we need to practice in a way that will create synapses and have them mature into a strong neural network. Essentially, the act stage relates to everything that we spoke about earlier. State relates to how we're feeling when we're going to engage in learning. This means physically, in terms of our health and fitness, as well as how much exercise we've done recently, but also our feelings towards a subject. We can't learn without a certain amount of emotional energy to motivate us to engage with a new task long enough for us to learn. Teach relates to what we said about earlier, about being able to teach the idea to someone else. It takes 4 months for a neural network to mature, and so we must keep practicing the new task. Enter means to enter time in our diary or calendar to follow up on practice, so that you're making time to consolidate the skill beyond the initial introduction. Finally, review is about actively recalling what we've learnt with spaced out repetition. Going over information at spaced out intervals helps the brain's ability to remember that information. So that's Jim Quick's process for learning. Although there are strong similarities with Sean D'Souza's model, there's a few extra elements thrown in. Jim also points to a key part of the learning process, and particularly if we want to speed up learning, and that's asking questions. There's a whole range of benefits to recognizing the importance of asking questions, and it plays out on a couple of different levels. Firstly, there's the practicality aspect. The more questions the student asks the teacher, the more the teacher is able to directly address steps or increments that they're getting stuck at. If the student doesn't understand, the teacher can look to break it down further, or look at different examples, or look at a different way to approach the task. Then, there's the aspect to which the teacher is able to ascertain the student's current understanding from the questions that they ask. The premise of their question is likely to indicate what they already know, and the content of their question is likely to indicate what they're stuck with. But Quick also talks about a deeper element to questions, and that's the questions that we ask ourselves. As Quick describes, every second, your senses gather up to 11 million bits of information. If we tried to understand and respond to each individual input, we'd be completely overwhelmed. And so our brain primarily serves as a filter to keep most of that information out. The conscious mind is usually processing more like 50 bits of information per second. And one of the ways that we're getting around this filter is to ask ourselves questions. The reason for this is what's called confirmation bias, which is the tendency to favour interpretations and recall information that confirms or supports an existing belief. For example, if we continue to ask ourselves why we're not good at something, we'll look for reasons to support that claim and continue to think of ourselves as not being good, having likely found sufficient evidence for that allegation. This is why limiting beliefs can be so damaging. Because if I'm thinking, why aren't I learning this fast enough? My brain's only going to give me the information related to that question. I'm only going to be able to identify reasons for why I'm not learning fast enough, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, transcending some of this stuff is definitely not easy, but it seems to me that this really relates to individuation. Limiting beliefs and these deeper questions that we ask ourselves are likely to come from our personal unconscious. We'll come back to this another time, but I just wanted to point out that it's relevant. I'm also aware of how difficult it can be to identify and transcend limiting beliefs. So that's definitely something that I'm keen to explore a bit more later on. But for today, I think it's worth recognising how we can start to make some of the deeper elements of our personality work for us instead of against us. If these overarching questions that we ask ourselves are set up to serve us and not hinder us, it can greatly enhance our learning. These overarching questions, or dominant questions, as Quick describes them, are the 1 or 2 most frequent questions that we ask ourselves related to our own beliefs. If these questions are negative, they will work against us and slow us down. But we can flip these questions around to be positive. And Quick suggests a couple of examples, such as, how can I use this? Why must I use this? When will I use this? If we're asking these sorts of questions as we learn a new skill or come across new information, we can absolutely supercharge our learning because they help to integrate the information with our existing knowledge. These positively connotated questions also help us to boost the state-dependent elements of learning, such as whether or not we have any emotional energy towards a task. If we're consuming information and we're asking ourselves, how can I use this? Regardless of what the information is, we're more likely to catalogue it away for a time that it will be useful. Surely this is what Bruce Lee did when he was dancing or boxing or fencing. He wasn't just performing a parallel skill to Wing Chun. He recognised that an increased understanding in other pursuits helped improve his ability as a fighter. It seems to me that questions such as, how can I use this, can compel us to engage with so many more fields of knowledge than if we just specialised in one subject. Now, I know I said that he had a bit more of a focus on being a teacher earlier, but I really want to tell you something that I actually learnt from Sean D'Souza that I think really helps with this question of how can I use this. At the start of each of these podcasts, as I'm sure you know, there's a story related to the themes of the podcast. That's something that I actually got from Sean. Now, another thing that I got from Sean is basically what enables me to do that. A few years ago, I read one of Sean's blogs on psychotactics.com, recommended highly, about the program Evernote. Evernote is a computer program that essentially works like a personal database. I think OneNote is the Microsoft version. But basically, as per Sean's idea, almost literally anything interesting that I've come across over the past couple of years, I've tagged and stored in Evernote. Even when I've been out with friends. Pretty rare, I must add. But I've been that guy who pulls out his phone and says, I'm so sorry, I've just got to write this down. So, whenever I'm watching something, reading something, listening to something, talking to someone, about anything that I find interesting, I catalogue it in Evernote. Now, when I do podcasts, I don't necessarily have to research the perfect story out of history. I can just look back in my Evernote at all the things that I've already found interesting. And I've already done the research in some ways and can go on to the more theoretical aspects of the podcast. Evernote is basically like my digital brain. But since I've started using Evernote and cataloguing everything that I've found interesting for potential use in a podcast, the question has sat there in the back of my mind. It hasn't necessarily always been a conscious thing, but now it's just something that's always on my radar. Is this interesting enough for a podcast? Is this interesting enough to add to Evernote? Now, almost literally anything I come across, that's the context that I approach it in. And I think it's made me so much more of a curious person. It's as if Evernote was a digital tool that allowed me to implant within myself that question. How can I use this? And that's something that I recommend for all podcasters. In fact, anyone really. Not only will you have an entire database of useful information that's individual to you, but you'll have your radar up. You'll implicitly be asking yourself whether something's useful enough to make it to Evernote. After discussing Leonardo da Vinci a few weeks ago too, one thing that stood out to me since is the depth of writing in his notebooks. Leonardo's notebooks were a bit like his second brain, and from my experience with Evernote, I bet they would have helped him catalogue information that he was able to call upon later. This catalogue gave him so much more access to information that he wouldn't have had he not gone to the effort in the first place. With something like Evernote or Leonardo's notebooks, you can create a cataloguing system that allows you to retain so much more information. And I think that Bruce Lee would have had his own concept of that catalogue too. So let's sum this up and bring everything back together. We've gone over a fair bit these past few episodes, and before moving on, I just want to go back over some of what we've learned. It seems that we've developed our understanding so much since then, but remember when we first came across Alan Gannett's 4 Laws of the Creative Curve in episode 9? Consumption, imitation, creative communities, and iterations. Since then, we've really dug into what the consumption and imitation phases of that process look like. We started with Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours concept. It's evident that we need a lot of practice to become world class at something, but it's not just about the time that we take to practice, it's about what we do with that time. It's about being purposeful in our practice and having a positive dominant question such as how can I use this that's going to help us connect with and catalogue much more information than if we'd just been tunnel focused. But then we learned that we can really supercharge our learning if we find a teacher who can help us create patterns to recognise what's good and bad. Then the teacher deconstructs the skill and helps us to understand each element of the skill, as well as its broader importance and function. Looking back now, recognising the difference between a teacher and a preacher has further helped me evaluate my own education. I can think back now and recognise where my good teachers were deconstructing tasks and where the bad ones were just preaching. For example, when I was younger, I played a lot of tennis. I was even fortunate enough to have tennis coaching for quite a while in my younger years. And looking back, my tennis coaches must have had some understanding of this system, because we categorise someone's ability to play tennis as a single skill. Either we're good at tennis or we're bad at tennis. But when you're learning tennis and having coaching, you perform drills. Heaps of other sports are like this, where the training component and the match day component are essentially different games. In tennis, you're doing forehand drills, where you might hit 50 in a row down the line, 50 in a row cross court, then backhand drills, then volleys and serving, before you might put it all together for some match play right at the end. This is the sport of tennis broken up into its incremental steps. Tennis isn't just one skill, it's many skills, like the forehand or the backhand or the serve. And the good coach will break down each one in such a way that their player will learn each skill in its increments. It was the same at footy training or cricket training. Rarely ever would it be a full match simulation. When we train for sport, we recognise that skills need to be broken down incrementally, and so we create drills to separate each increment so we can practice it in isolation. So doing drills seems to be a way to isolate tiny increments within a skill. And we can reverse engineer this process too. If you want to learn something new, well then it's worth finding a teacher to help us become proficient. Or if not, start building up many good examples and bad examples and recognise the similarities and differences between the two. If we understand this process, we can not only help those under our tutelage pick up a skill, we can learn so many more skills ourselves. If we have a positive dominant question, such as how can I use this in the pursuit of my broader goals, we can supercharge our ability to engage with new information across a wide variety of subjects. Therefore, we can supercharge our learning to the point where it's essentially continuous. We're never really switched off to the possibility that we can gain something from a situation. So why is this all important? It's one thing to recognise that Bruce Lee and Leonardo da Vinci were able to do something, but where does this actually leave us? Well, Sean D'Souza points to two things. Firstly, the more we learn within our own field, the more we can stand out as having exceptional knowledge. But then, the more that we learn in other fields, the more creative we become. The more we're able to connect seemingly tenuous links between things, like cha-cha and kung fu, or painting portraiture and psychology. The more that we can integrate wider fields of knowledge into our understanding, the more we become truly individual. Eventually, it's likely there's no one else in the world who connects certain things in the way that we do. And people like Bruce Lee, Leonardo, Auguste Rodin, Pablo Picasso, James McNeill Whistler, they've all been able to leverage this to become world famous. I'm not saying it's easy, but I don't think anyone would have been able to do what they did just like them. And that's part of what made them great. Also, I think it leads us to having more in common with people if we find more things interesting. If you have a broad range of knowledge, you can connect with more people than if you'd only had a narrow set of interests. And even if you don't fully resonate with them immediately, you recognise that you have something to gain from a different approach. We can start to see people who are different as being of benefit to us because they can help to increase our perspective. So I know that this is something that I still have a long way to go with, but I really feel that we're on the right track with some of this stuff. This idea of the dominant question is fascinating to me because I think we're really beginning to see the intersection with individuation. It's about creating and tapping into positive narratives that we tell ourselves and becoming more fully ourselves by engaging in and connecting with our own unique set of interests. So this is definitely something I'm keen to explore a bit more as we go on. Subscribe to the podcast so you can stay tuned. That's all we've got time for today. Check out the episode page for today and all the other episode pages at individuate.com.au. I'll put up all my resources for today, as well as that brilliant video with the British sheep farmer. Again, I can't recommend it enough. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today. I hope to do it again on the next episode of Individuate.